circumstances. There's a question that apocalyptic literature is always basically getting at. The essential question to this whole long chapter 8 is, how long, oh Lord, how long? Right? How long is this going to go on? And then you get into questions like, well, what's the this? Is it the world, or is it the oppression, or so forth. So, I would like for us to take just a minute and read this before Mickey starts talking, because I think it will be helpful. And I hope you found yourself applying some of the things you've learned about symbolism, etc. For example, what did you do, and I can see it easier in my version, what did you do when you saw something about 2,100 and something? Are you with me? There's a number in there.
2,300 evenings and mornings.
Mm-hmm. Did that make you think anything other than 2,300 evenings? Anything else cross your mind? Right or wrong? It doesn't have to be right. Well, Pastor Pat immediately got out a pencil and tried to divide it by 3. 3.5 would be how long negative times last, right? Isn't that what we learned about symbolism? And it doesn't work. But what we'll learn, maybe not for Mickey, but I'll just tell you, is that basically, because it's day and night and so forth, it comes out real close to 3.5 years. So anyway, all right. Who loves to read aloud? You get so tired of my voice, I know. Ted, can you read that literature? I mean, the font size.
The big print, yes.
Okay. Why don't you read till you get tired when you stop and call somebody else?
In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar, thank you.
Good word. Yeah.
The 3rd year rule of a vision came to me.
Yeah.
Daniel, sometime after the early vision I had, I saw this vision. And as I experienced it, I was in the walled city of Susa, in the province of Elam, by the Beulah Canal. When I lifted my eyes, I suddenly saw a ram with 2 horns standing in front of the canal. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. The higher one came up after the other one. I saw the ram going west, north, and south. No animal could resist the ram, and no one could stop it, recusing others from its power. The ram did whatever it pleased. It became powerful. I was trying to understand this when suddenly a he-goat came from the west, crossing the entire earth, but not touching the ground. Between this goat's eyes was a horn that was a sight to see. The he-goat came to the ram and had 2 horns. The one I'd seen standing in front of the canal. The he-goat charged the ram in powerful anger. I saw the he-goat approach the ram. It was enraged at the ram and attacked it, shattering the ram's 2 horns. The ram couldn't resist the he-goat. The he-goat threw the ram on the ground and trampled on it. No one could rescue the ram from the he-goat's power. The he-goat became even greater, but at the height of its power, its large horns snapped. In its place, 4 horns, each a sight to see, came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. A single, very small horn came out of one of the 4 horns. It grew bigger and bigger, stretching toward the south, the east, and the beautiful country. It grew as high as the heavenly forces, until it finally threw some of them and some of the stars down to the earth. Then it trampled on them. It grew high as the very leader of those forces, taking the daily sacrifice away from him and overturning his holy place. In an act of rebellion, another force will take control of the daily sacrifice. It will throw truth to the ground and will succeed in everything it does.
Okay, let's take a breath there for just a second. So far, a piece of cake, right? You understand absolutely everything that's going on. You can just write it for your child or your grandchild or somebody, and you can tell them exactly what's going on. But do you have a better shot at it than you had a month ago? Probably, yes. But it's like, so far it sounds like the state fair, and they're just having a big old, some kind of rodeo going on. Okay, all right. You doing okay, Ted? We can hear you well, okay?
All right. I then heard a certain holy one speaking. The second holy one said to the first one, "How long will this vision last?" The one concerning the daily sacrifice, the desolating rebellion, and the handing over of the sanctuary and its forces to be trampled. He said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be restored." Now I, Daniel, needed help understanding the vision along with the rest of us. I saw suddenly, standing in front of me was someone who looked like a man. I then heard a human voice coming out of the center of the Eula Canal. It called out, "Gabriel, help this person understand what he has seen." Gabriel approached me, and I was terrified when he came. I fell with my face to the ground. Gabriel said to me, "Know this human one, the vision is for the end times." As soon as he said this to me, I fell into a trance. My face was still on the ground. Then Gabriel touched me and set me upon my feet. He said, "Now I am going to tell you what will happen during the time of doom that is coming, because at the appointed time there will be an end. The two horned ram you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The long-haired he-goat is the king of Greece, and the big horn between its eyes is the first king. The horn that snapped so that four came out in its place means the four kingdoms will come from one nation. But these four won't have the strength of the first one. When their kingship nears its end and their sins are almost complete, the king will step forward. He will be stern and a master of deception. At the height of his power, he will wreak unbelievable destruction. He will succeed in all he does. He will destroy both the mighty and the people of the holy ones, along with his cunning. He will succeed by using deceit. In his own mind, he will be great. In his own mind, he will be great. In a time of peace, he will bring destruction on many, opposing even the supreme leader. But he will be broken, and not by a human hand. Now this vision of evening and morning, which has been announced, is true. But you must seal it up, because it is for days far in the future. Then I, Daniel, was overwhelmed and felt sick for days. When I finally got up and went about the king's business, I remained troubled by the vision and couldn't understand it.
Well, I hope none of us will be sick for days. But that's quite a passage, isn't it? When it says, and I want to get onto Nikki here, but this fascinates me. We can spend an hour just looking at this text. When it says, at the appointed time, there will be an end. Is that kind of open-ended? No pun intended. An end to what? Life? No. An end to
All conflict.
It could be, yeah. It could easily be the end of this terrible time they're going through. But it also could be interpreted as the end of the world as we know it, right? Yeah. There's something else I wanted to look at. It just says very nonchalantly, it called out Gabriel, help this person understand what he's seeing. Just like we've heard Gabriel forever, right? Now we're in the book of Daniel. That's right far into the Old Testament. Can you think of all the other times that you've heard Gabriel's name mentioned before this, or Michael, or one of the other angels? I hope not. This is the first time in Scripture that an angel has been named. So, I think that's a little piece of trivia, but I think it's interesting. I think what we'll do now, and do not misunderstand, at the end of this lesson, you're not going to have this entire chapter worked out. We're not going to focus on it. It's an example. So let's let Nikki share about your first real diving into an apocalyptic chapter. No, you're fine. If you can't see that, feel free to.
Welcome to Session 4 of Revelation. This lesson begins on page 28 of your participant workbook.
Let's turn to talk a little bit about apocalyptic literature specifically. I want to talk about the book of Daniel. Let me find Daniel. It's in the Bible here somewhere. Right after Lamentations, right after Ezekiel. And the book of Daniel, it was written about 165 BC. Daniel was written to the Hebrew people in Palestine. You remember I said to you before that the Hebrew people were under the control of somebody else from 538 to 141. We're talking about a period here of about 175 to 141. Now, in the middle of this, there was a king that ruled over them, one of the Greek successors, who ruled over these people and said to them, you're going to give up your Judaism. You're going to give up your religion. You're going to give up your tradition. You're just going to become Greeks. And you know that that was not going to go over too big. And so they rebelled against this. But what we had here was a period where the Hebrew people down there in Palestine were being persecuted for their faith. They were told to give it up. If you got caught with a copy of the Torah, you were subject to execution. If a mother had her male son circumcised on the 8th day in accordance with the law, according to 2 Maccabees, if the soldiers of Antiochus, who was the king at that time, if the soldiers of Antiochus found out about it, they would go into the house, they would execute the baby, they would tie the dead baby around the mother's neck, and make her walk through the streets of the villages and towns with the dead baby dangling around her neck as a warning, we're serious about this, and so you don't defy us. We're talking real persecution here, aren't we? The temple in Jerusalem was made into a temple in honor of the Greek god Zeus, and a statue of Zeus was set up in the temple. The Hebrews call it the abomination of desolation, or the desolating sacrilege, as it were. And guess what? They sacrificed pigs on the altar of God in the temple in Jerusalem. This was an apocalyptic time, wasn't it? And so the book of Daniel was written about 160. This persecution began in 167. It concluded in 164. The book of Daniel assumes that the persecution has begun. It predicts the end of the persecution. So therefore, obviously, it's written after the time it began, but before the time it was over. So the reputable scholars, notice how carefully I said that, the reputable scholars, date this book rightly about 165. The first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel are wisdom stories, which we talked about wisdom being one of the developments in the post-exilic period. But the chapters 7 through 12, that's those chapters contain a series of self-contained visionary units. Let's look at one of them just to get your feet wet into how you interpret apocalyptic. If you understand the time, the place, the apocalyptic method, etc., etc., if you do that, you can understand apocalyptic. It's not a code to be figured out. It is symbolism, yes, and it is symbolism that we are far removed from, but if we understand the historical setting and the way in which apocalyptic is written, guess what? It won't be a puzzle. And you know what? Usually and frequently, the author explains it anyhow. So let's look at Daniel 8. It's one of those self-contained visionary units. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at first. And I saw in the vision, I was in Susa the capital, in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, I was at the river Ulai. And I raised my eyes and I looked, and behold, there was a ram standing on the banks of the river. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram charging to the west and to the north and to the south. Note those directions. And no beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. And as I was considering that, behold, there came a he-goat from the west, across the face of the entire earth, not even touching the ground. And the goat had one conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the river. He ran at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come close to the ram. He was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. But the ram had no power to stand before him. He was cast to the ground, and the he-goat trampled upon him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from the power of the he-goat. And then the he-goat magnified himself exceedingly. When he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of the heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the hosts of the stars it cast to the ground and trampled upon them. It magnified itself, even up to the prince of the host. The continual burnt offering was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. The host was given over to it, together with the continual burnt offering through transgression. Truth was cast to the ground, and the horn acted and prospered. And I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the continual burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said 2,300 evenings and mornings. Notice you'll have to divide that by 2, won't you, to find days? And then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. Now when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. Behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a human being, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it said, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O son of man," he's talking to Daniel, "that the vision is for the time of the end." Notice what that says and what it does not say. It says the time of the end, not the end of time. You see, it's so easy to switch those words around, isn't it? And if you are predisposed to think that this is going to tell us about the end of time, to translate it that way and interpret it that way, even though that's not what it says. The time of the end. The time of the end of what? The persecution. Now let's stop there for a moment and go back with your knowledge of history and your knowledge now of what apocalyptic is, what the symbols stand for, how it sort of operates. Let's see if we can understand this vision. He says, "I saw a ram with 2 horns. One came up, and then there was a second one that came up. The second one was larger. And the ram went to the west and to the north and to the south, and no beast could stand before it. Now remember, a beast or an animal in apocalyptic represents what? A nation. What nation in antiquity started as one nation, sort of got swallowed up and became a part of a larger nation and expanded to the west and to the north and to the south? The Median-Persian Empire. Absolutely. And then there's a he-goat who comes from the west, coming so fast he doesn't even touch the ground. Who's that? That's the Macedonian Greeks. And you remember one of the things they said about the Greek army in that time was that it came so quickly, it looked as if it wasn't even touching the ground. And of course, the one big horn between his eyes represents the king, who was Alexander the Great. Everybody in ancient history understood who the first great king of the Greeks was. And of course, who was it that destroyed the Median-Persian Empire? Alexander and the Greeks. And then the he-goat magnified himself exceedingly. What happened to Alexander in the height of his power? He dies. And his generals fight among themselves, and ultimately they decide to do what? Divide Alexander's kingdom into how many parts? 4 parts. And each one of the generals gets a fourth. And then out of one of them came a little horn. Remember now, a horn is usually a symbol of a ruler. A little horn which grew rather large toward the glorious land. Well, clearly, what's the glorious land? Palestine and Jerusalem and Judea. And it magnified itself. It takes away the continual burnt offering. It sets up an abomination of desolation in the holy place. What's that a reference to? Antiochus' persecution and desecration of the temple. And the saints cry out, "Oh, how long, O Lord? 2,300 evenings and mornings," which if you divide it by 2 becomes about what? 3.5 years, doesn't it? And then Daniel is told, seal up the vision, because it is for the time of the end. The time of the end of what? The persecution. Now you say, oh, that can't be. This is about the end time. This is about the end of the world. This has to be connected with the coming of Jesus. Well, that's an a priori presupposition that some people make, but the text has got to support that presupposition, doesn't it, for it to be true. And the explanation that we just gave seems to fit the context here, doesn't it? But if you don't believe me, would you believe the text? Let's keep reading that. And he was speaking, as he was speaking to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and set me on my feet, and he said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation," meaning the latter end of what? The persecution. It pertains to the appointed time of the end. Remember, the apocalyptic writers believe that God would only allow evil to go so far before God would intervene and take away the source of the persecution. Now, as for the ram with the 2 horns, these are the kingdoms of Media and Persia. No. That's Iran and Iraq, isn't it? No. It's Persia. The he-goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn, the kingdom of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. Well, again, who would the first king of the Greeks be? Alexander. Now, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms will arise from his, but not with his power, and toward the latter end of their rule. Remember, we're talking here about 165. By this time, 2 of the successors of Alexander, those states, have already fallen to whom? Rome. And Rome is beginning to loom on the horizon over here in the east. Palestine and Persia over in one part of it, and Egypt in the other. And the Romans are bearing down upon that particular part of the world. At the latter end of their rule, when the transgressors have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance One who understands riddles shall arise. And Antiochus, who was the king that was persecuting the people, guess what? Prided himself on being able to solve riddles. His power shall be great. He shall cause fearful destruction. He shall succeed in what he does. He will destroy mighty people and the people of the saints. And by his cunning he will make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he will magnify himself. Without warning he will destroy many. He will rise up against the prince of princes, but by no human hand he will be broken. The vision of the evenings and the mornings which has been told is true, but seal it up, for it pertains to many days hence. You say, well, what does it mean, many days hence? One of the characteristics of apocalyptic literature was that it was always written in the name of some worthy or hero of the past. The book of Daniel in the name of Daniel, who supposedly was there back during the Babylonian captivity. It wasn't written then, but it was written in the name of Daniel. Now, this was very characteristic of the writing of many people, not simply the Hebrews, but many people at that particular time and place. Namely, they would write something in the name of a great leader of the past. And that's what it means, you know, from the time of the Babylonian captivity to this particular time, it would be many days, wouldn't it? So that's what the text basically means. What he is saying is, keep the faith. It won't be long. God is going to intervene, going to take away the source of the persecution, and there's going to be a new age established with the persecution gone. Is that the end of the world? No. It is the end of a period of persecution. And he tells them in the book that it's going to happen soon. This book was written about 165. Guess when the persecution ended? In 164. Was he right? He was right. If he was predicting the end of the world, was he right? No. He was right. He was writing to those people to say, you keep the faith, you stay the course, no matter what the cost. Because your commitment and your sacrifice is part of something far greater than just this little piece of cosmic history. Your sacrifice and your willing to witness right now is a part of the ultimate victory of good over evil. And you'll have a part in that victory if you keep the faith and stay the course. That's what apocalyptic is all about. Staying the course and keeping the faith when it may mean the sacrifice of yourself. Well, we're just about out of time. And so next time, we're going to begin, we're just going to hit the floor running next time by looking at the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is the only full apocalyptic book in the whole Bible. Daniel is half apocalyptic, and that's the only apocalyptic book in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, the only apocalyptic book is Revelation, but it is a full-fledged apocalyptic book. And we will be talking about about Revelation as an apocalyptic book next time. And remember, it's a series of self-contained visionary units that aren't really chronologically connected to each other, but each one teaches something directly to those people under persecution and under duress at that particular time and place. So interpret it as an apocalyptic book, understand it as an apocalyptic book, and you'll be surprised at how easy it is to understand. It's really not complicated. People say, oh, I just don't understand it. I just stay away from it. I'm afraid of it. Don't be afraid of it. It's not a scary book. It's a book of hope. It's a book of hope.
Here's a trip. Do you get the feeling he knows some stuff you don't know?
I think you read ahead.
Yeah, I said, it's just simple. It's a piece of cake. Let me interject here now, as your on-the-ground teacher. There is no intention on my part to have you finish this course sometime next year. No, I'm just kidding. To finish this course and be biblical scholars. That doesn't mean that you won't be, but it won't be because of what we're gonna do in this class. Does that make sense? That's not possible. But my goal would be that you, first and foremost, will appreciate revelations in a way that you never have before. And that you would not be afraid of it or try to stay away from it. Which doesn't mean that you're gonna understand it all, but you're gonna understand the purposes, if that makes sense. The other thing would be that, not each of you in the same way, but to some extent, there'll be things where you'll say, the biblical scholars have been able to go back into ancient books and ancient cultures and traditions and so forth, and ferreted out some of these things that I could sit here and stare at them all day and I wouldn't say, oh, that means a duck and a goose, you know. Then you might want to go and see a commentary or something to learn a little bit more that you won't learn here. Does that make sense? And I think the most important thing would be that when you're reading anything in the Bible, and possibly other literature, but anything in the Bible, if it doesn't sound like God, if it doesn't make sense, or if it's beyond your understanding, that you don't just, I'm not smart enough to understand that. You may not know enough. There's a difference of being smart and being ignorant. We're ignorant of almost everything in Revelation. But that doesn't mean we're not smart enough to learn. Does that make sense? Ignorance is just not knowing. I said that to a friend of mine about a year ago, and she still hates me. Well, I told her Elizabeth Warren's brother had died, and she said, who's Elizabeth Warren? What was I supposed to say, except ignorance is rampant? But anyway.
Can't fix stupid.
But anyway, I digress.
You can fix ignorance.
I want to hit the questions first this time. I usually leave them toward the end, and then we kind of get off on things. But just one thing before we do that, because Mickey kept saying, well, is this as clear as the nose on your face? It isn't really that clear, is it? But it's clearer because you know a little bit about symbolism. Yeah. It could have been reduced down. This is just Pat's opinion. That chapter, in my opinion, could have been reduced down to a good paragraph. Right? This is what's happening. This is who's in charge. This is what they're doing to our religion, and it's horrible. And these are the things that we can look forward to, but we have to keep our faith, and the end is going to be okay. Isn't that what chapter 8 says? But it gives you a little more history than that. Okay. Any questions about that so far? Anything Mickey said that was a little bit of an exaggeration? Okay. Look on page 31. Now, there was method to my madness. In my mind, you came here today having read chapter 8 individually. Then we experienced chapter 8 together. And then we heard the one and only Mickey read it. So I hope that by that third reading, it wasn't as cacophonous or whatever to your ears. It wasn't as painful or confusing to hear. So when the vision is read with a sense of apocalyptic symbolism, that might be redundant, but anyway, and a little knowledge of the history of time, does the text become easier to understand? Well, let me help you. Does it become harder to understand? No. Easier is a relative term, isn't it? Easier as opposed to easy. I would say my answer would be yes. It is easier for me to understand with what I've learned about apocalyptic literature, but not necessarily easy. Do we know more about powers that be, the nations, some of the big leaders, that sort of thing right now than people that will read about it 500 years from now?
Yes.
Yes. So when he's rattling all this stuff off, and everybody knew Alexander the Great, and everybody knew that, well, back then they would have, because they would have been on the front page of the newspaper. Well, whatever. Okay? So, it makes sense that if we're reading something written for us in a format that we understand, then we're likely to get the nuances and the innuendos, just like he was saying with symbolism about some of our political leaders. If we were to take for just a moment, pull something out and apply it to today, and I were to say, he was a great man, or he is a great man in his own mind. Any current leaders might come to your mind. You don't have to say them out loud. No, you know. So we have that we would know kind of what's going on there. But Mickey said something in passing about the text that he said, of course that's Iran and Iraq. Why did he say that so sarcastically? Why do you think he said it so sarcastically?
I imagine there are some people preaching from the pulpit that that's exactly what this referred to.
It has to be that because they're looking at this, assuming it's going to be a message about the end of the world. And Iran and Iraq are obviously going to make the end of the world come. So that's what he was saying is don't take this apocalyptic story beyond what it is. It was written to these people about that time. Can we extrapolate somewhat and relate it to our own times? Yes. But this is one place that we can't do it one for one. We can't say this says tree, therefore it means this. But we could say it's kind of like. Anytime a leader grows up in a nation and then he's knocked off and another leader comes along, we can see those similarities. So, you're saying it's easier. I didn't look all that excited, but anyway, we'll say it's easier. Okay, number 2, discuss how the text guides the reader. Discuss how the text guides the reader in understanding an apocalyptic vision using Daniel 8 as an example. Do you think that's true?
Yeah.
Does it help Daniel at all? The first half of chapter 8, do you think Daniel's a little perplexed?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's right there with us, right? Does he stay perplexed? A little bit. But does he gain some understanding?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I think Mickey's asking in this question, is how does chapter 8 guide the reader in understanding the vision that we see in Daniel 8? Well, it gives us some pretty clear answers. One of the things that's neat about chapter 8 is we know that prolonged question that people are always asking, even people who think they're being persecuted and have it the best they've ever had it, like us, will say, how long, Lord? How long is this pandemic going to go on? How long is this going to go on? It answers the question in this book, doesn't it? In chapter 8, it provides a clear-cut answer. So there is a guide. I think it's a guide that would have been much more helpful to people of the time for which this was written. And you could say, well, then if that's the case, wasn't chapter 8 or wasn't the book of Daniel or even the book of Revelation kind of a waste if people all further down the road couldn't understand it? Maybe. But remember, canonization came about in the 4th century pretty much. That's 400 years after Jesus' time, but it's not an eternity. And so they saw enough good in those books to include them. But we're dependent on scholars and being able to know more about language and traditions than we do. Have I confused you? Questions? Does that help any? It does seem kind of like, well, why would they put something in there that nobody of the 21st century is going to understand? Well, it wasn't put in the Bible last week. It was put in the Bible close to 2,000 years ago. Number 3, if we can relate the visionary elements from beasts and horns to historical circumstances, does that diminish the power of the text? No. Let me say it a different way. If this visionary text is more a story and it's about real beasts and horns, Does that make it a better text? To me, that just makes it more like some Wild West thing you might see on TV or something, right?
Yes.
So if you look at it from that perspective, then I think it's pretty easy to see that not only does it not diminish the power of text, it strengthens it because it's like, it's talking about all these leaders, not this many, these key leaders and what they've done and what happens to them and who takes over and where this is moving. Without that, nothing really is happening.
What do you think a cartoonist would do with this?
What, dear?
What do you think a cartoonist would do with this?
Have a ball.
Don't know if you could do the whole chapter in one cartoon, but I think a cartoonist would have a field day with it. Yeah. You might even want to play around with that. That's a great question. It really is. At the very beginning of chapter 8, it talks about here comes this from the west, and here comes that from the north, and here comes that from the south. Did you answer your own question about why the east is never mentioned? Where did the wise people come from at Christmas?
From the east.
From the east. And we pretty well know now that that was Persia. And Persia was the top dog, Okay. Whenever Scripture talks about the four winds, or the corners, the four corners of the world, that's another a poetic way sort of saying the entire world. North, south, east, west, that pretty well sums it up. Anyone want to add something? Add a point? Add a understanding? Okay. 4. How does the attempt to relate the symbolism of Daniel 8, or other apocalyptic passages for that matter, to modern geopolitical forces or entities do an injustice to the originally inspired text? The answer is simpler than it looks. Somebody's got the answer. They're going to tell us. Who's talking?
It does.
Huh?
I would think it does.
Okay, she said she doesn't think it does. Well, I think I know where she's coming from, but she's going to change her mind in just 1 second. Because we have said over and over now today that apocalyptic literature is about a specific time and place. When Jesus taught a parable, was that about a really specific true time and place? No. So it's a lot easier to be applicable in our own times. And it isn't to say that we can't apply it, but if we translate it literally, they said Herod, but they didn't mean Herod. They meant Khrushchev. That would be wrong. That would be wrong. Okay? So when they're talking about these symbols, they're talking about the leaders of that day. Now, if we say, that would be kind of like, say, Putin, or kind of like one of the Ayatollahs or whatever, yeah, you could see that, but not to treat it as being the same as the geopolitical forces of today, because that really isn't what it was intended to be. That can be a little bit confusing. So if you want to chew that up a little bit or talk about that, that's okay. It all goes back to the types of literature in the Bible. And that's why I'm so pleased that you're getting a handle on that, where so many people reading it, just read it, I don't have my Bible in front of me, just read it as all those books that are written in the very same style, as if they were typed out within the same time frame. No, but you know better than that, and you understand that. And so it does behoove us to step back sometimes and say, okay, now wait a minute. What kind of literature are we talking about? You're very quiet. Are you thinking? Are you unhappy? Are you happy? Are you thinking about dinner? I just don't want you to be discouraged. Because we had a couple people drop out because it was just going to be more work than they were willing to do. And I would guarantee that every one of you I could put on a continuum, not from there, I don't mean it that way. At the end of this course, we will all be in a different place with our understanding and even our reaction to what we've learned. That's okay, okay? Like I used to tell teachers all the time, give all the kids cream. If they don't get all the cream, they'll get some of it. But don't give them water. They're not gonna help. That's not gonna help them any. Give them something real. So you're gonna get the cream of this, but you may not get the whole cup. You might get just a taste of it. So hang in there if you're at all discouraged. I just wish some of you would share because I know that your thoughts are better than mine. And I'd love to hear them. Oh, that didn't work.
Well, it makes us think. I still makes me compare what was happening then.
Yes,
Really,
and I'm okay with that.
what
And
I
you're like, I don't care whether you're okay with it or not. I'm okay with that as long as we don't say,
I'm saying. It's the
therefore it must be the end of the world, because this wasn't the end of the world either, yeah. The end of the world is gonna come when it comes. And there again, I think my theology there is a little bit different from some people's, because I'm not sure why God would create this world and then destroy it. But that's another story for another day. But the end of, do you think the end of the persecution of the Ukrainian people will come? I do.
It will.
At what cost and at what
Yeah,
loss
that's
and what
the question.
pain, unbelievable. But that persecution will end. We don't know how, we don't know when. So, we can see things like that. It just makes me sick. That's a good thought, Jan, thank you. Anybody else have a thought that this is stirring up in your own hearts and minds? I hope a couple of you want to go back and kind of review some of your old world literature and your old world history, because it's been a long time since most of us studied any of that at all. So, but next week, I know every time I suggest next week, but next week we actually get started with Revelation. Ta-da. And your homework you did at the very beginning of the course.
Yeah.
But now you know a lot more. So between now and next week, I want you to read Revelation chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. And I would hope you would read it more than once. And maybe if you have the capability to read it in more than one translation. Does the term Bible Gateway mean anything to any of you on the computer? Bible Gateway. If you use computer at all, if you do any searches, write that down. All, Bible, Gateway. I love Bible Gateway. And if you type that in, you can go in and you can put in different passages, and you can put in about 50 at least different translations. Please don't do that, because some of them are no. But to read it, maybe in the Common English Bible and the Old King James and the New King James and Revised Standard Version, but read it in a few different versions. It's really cool to do that. And you can actually join it for a minimal fee, like I think I paid $3 or $4 a month, maybe. And then you can go into commentaries and different, there's just lists of books and things, if you have an interest in that. So, if you're a computer person at all, just check out Bible Gateway. I do recommend it. Anything else?
Mm-hmm.
What are
What did you say to read for next time?
Say again, I'm sorry.
What chapters did you say to read?
Oh, just chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. Some of you will memorize it, I'm sure. No? Okay. Not really. Not really. Do you remember? Oh, that was a different class, wasn't it? Yeah. We didn't learn the books of the Bible in order here. That was a different class.
No.
But for those of you that did that, and maybe remember some about the order of the books of the Bible, you'll remember that Daniel falls in with the group that we call the prophets. Yeah. So that makes it very interesting. I really don't think there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but I don't think there's anything that you all would necessarily want me to lift up. There was, hold on just a second. to share this. I've always liked this. Okay. How long? Finally, there is the agonized question in chapter 8. How long? The second major theme of this chapter is that the time of wrath is limited, and thus the people's suffering is limited as well. This is surely one of the most powerful appeals of apocalyptic literature and apocalyptic movements. Theologically, it is one of the most important messages of the book of Daniel for a modern world. It is the promise of the justice that will be. Surely, this is the most important function of last judgment scenes, such as the division of the sheep from the goats in Matthew 25, or most powerfully, the Lazarus legend in Luke 16:19-31. Judgment scenes clearly are an important coexistent theme with reversal of fortune motifs in these materials. I thought that was, for me, that was just a nice little summary of the purpose that's set up. Well, if no one wants to share or ask questions, then I don't think we can do anything more blessed than to pray a prayer together on page 31. I'll give you a chance to turn to 31 again. Let's pray. Dear God,
we live in a world
and a time of strife and fear. We know our nation is more multiple than many, but we too feel the effects of the turmoil in little ways and great ways. Grant us the strength to stay the course, to live and act on the side of good, and to be your agent in all we say and do. We make this prayer in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, it's unheard of for me to let any class out early.
Couldn't be a
Feel free to
better
stay.
time.
What, dear?
Couldn't be a better time than prayer. Right.
I know. And you know,
Because
you
we're
said,
all,
well, it was
we're all
written.
feeling,
Nikki wrote it years and years and years ago. Jesus doesn't come when we call him, but he gets here just in time. Yes, and prayer's right on time. Absolutely. Feel free to stay and discuss or socialize or whatever, but officially we are dismissed.